Welcome back to the CHRONO TALK channel, and in this video I will talk about ETA and Sellita. Stay tuned. Okay, so I believe that most of you already heard about these terms, ETA or Sellita, and probably a lot of you even know exactly what they are, which is movement manufacturers, but maybe not all of you know exactly the differences and why they make movements that are so similar. So I always like to go to the very basics of everything to get a complete understanding. So yes, the first thing to know is that both ETA and Sellita are movement manufacturers in Switzerland. They make movements for a lot of different brands, and this is a normal thing in the Swiss watchmaking industry. The outsourcing is the very basis of their industry. It always was. The Swiss watchmaking industry always relied in this outsourcing because they believe that it's better to let the guys that knows exactly how to make cases and dials and hands and mainsprings and screws and everything, it's better to let them make these components if they are experts on this. And the brands, what they do is to purchase the components and assemble the watches. Of course, that there are companies that are essentially assemblers only. They do not manufacture anything. But even the biggest manufacturers, which is the companies that make their own movements, even them, they have to purchase small components from specialists. One exception, that is one brand that it's almost 100% verticalized, is Rolex. Rolex really makes almost everything that goes in their watches. Okay, there is very few components that are not made by them. So having companies that specialize in making movements was always the most common thing on the Swiss industry. It's actually hard to believe that between 1940 and 1960, Switzerland had more than 250 movement makers, and all of them located between Bienne and La Chaux-de-Fonds and Le Locle as well. But 2 decades before that, in the mid-1920s, because of financial difficulties, some brands had to get together in form of holdings, and the biggest of the manufacturers were FAGF, which is the Fabrique d'Horlogerie de Fontaine-Melon, and Adolf Schild. They got together and founded the holding called Ébauche SA. In case you don't know, ébauche is the French name for unfinished movements, because it was usual to the movement manufacturers make the entire movement, completely fully assembled and ready to use movement, or just the ébauche. The ébauche was the incomplete movement that they can supply to the brands, and the brands they ended up the finishing, or maybe putting their own components or customizing the movements and things like that. That's what ébauche is an uncompleted movement. So Ébauche SA was founded in 1926, and later they englobated another brands, another movement manufacturers like Felsa, Venus, Pesu, Fleurier, Eterna, Unitas, and Valjoux. And the most important, the movement division of Eterna, which was ETA SA. The problem was that the end of the 1920s was coming, and as you probably know, the entire world was in difficulties, in financial difficulties, and this holding by itself wasn't sufficient to get everybody up. So a bigger holding was needed, and that's when they founded the ASWAG in 1931. ASWAG is an acronym for, yes, forget about it. I'm not trying to say this because it's in German, but I will put right here the meaning of ASWAG, and I'm not going to try to spell that. And they did that with the help of the Swiss government and banks. And during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, Ebosch SA was the main supplier of movements to the entire Swiss industry. The problem was that brands that wasn't inside the group, they just go bankrupt and disappeared for a certain time. For example, Angelus, Excelsior, Universal, and Movado was one of the brands that you probably know. They basically disappeared because of the existence of Ebosch SA. They couldn't hold on. And actually, on the same 1930, another big holding emerged. It was the union of Omega, Tissot, and the chronograph manufacturer Lemania. The SSYAG was the biggest competitor to the ASWAG, but even though at the end of the 70s, because of the Quartz Crisis. Quartz Crisis was a moment when basically the emergence of the quartz movements and cheap quartz movements from Asia basically led to an entire crisis on the Swiss watchmaking industry, and basically almost everybody bankrupted. And I will talk about the Quartz Crisis in a specific episode because it's a very important part of the watchmaking history. And by the beginning of the 1980s, the variety of movements produced by Ebosch SA, that was almost 150 different movements, they dropped it to about 40. And they decided that every brand inside the ASWAG holding was starting to receive the name ETA SA. That's why a lot of movements that was in the past named with their original name, like Unitas, Pesu, or Valjoux, they turned out to become ETA. That's why even though a lot of people know the classic Valjoux 7750 as a Valjoux, it actually became an ETA 7750. And on the attempt to save the Swiss watchmaking industry, the Swiss banks formed a new holding called SMAG that was actually the union of the biggest holdings, that was the SSYAG and the ASWAG, because both were about to get bankrupt. And this new holding not only get hold of the movement manufacturers, but as well the famous watch brands like Omega, Longines, Rado, Tissot, Mido, Breguet, and some others. And also the Swatch. Actually, the Swatch was the new brand that was the Swiss response for the Quartz Crisis. And this also, it's better to be told over a completely separate episode, the history of the Swatch. But basically, the Swatch was what saved the SMAG group, and that later would be called the Swatch group. So basically, what happened is that during the 80s and the 90s, the ETA was the main supplier of movements to basically 9 of every 10 Swiss watches. And what happened is what in the beginning of the 2000s, the Swatch Group president decided or announced that ETA would stop supplying Ebosch to brands that weren't from the Swatch Group. The brands could still purchase complete movements, but it was out of question because it wouldn't make a sense to to purchase a complete movement and throw away half of the parts to put your own parts and your own finishing. It would be way too expensive. So this led to this trend that we saw over the last 20 years, that was brands making their own movements, this in-house or manufactured movement, because it started because of this, which in some way it was a positive move, because it makes everybody to, you know, start moving and make their own movements. And that's why some brands that were never a manufacturer, they become a manufacturer then, because they started making their own movements. That's one of the simplest definitions of manufacturer, which is a brand that makes, designs and makes their own movement. But the downside is that smaller brands that didn't have the capacity to design and develop their own movements, they would go out of business. And actually, the Swiss Commission of Commercial Competition, they decided that this was an abusive practice, and they forced the Swatch group to elongate the lead time to stop supplying those movements. And what actually happened is that today nobody knows exactly what the story is, because there is brands that are not from the Swatch group that are still able to purchase ETA movements. Why? I don't know, but it's a fact that brands outside the group still have ETA movements, and those movements weren't from an old stock. They were purchased recently, and that's when the Solita comes into the game. Actually, because ETA was the major supplier of movements for all the brands during the 80s and especially the 90s, they had to outsource part of their production. Even though they have a lot of different plants all over Switzerland, they had to outsource things like small components or part of the components, or the finishing and the assembly of the movements. That's what they call in French as finissage and assemblage. And Solita was one of those outsourced companies that made finissage and assemblage for ETA. And at the same time that all of this happened, another thing happened in parallel, that was that the patent for those classic ETA movements, it turns out to become public after all of those years in production, which meant that basically anybody could make their own version of the ETA movements. So basically the ETA 2824 and their families like the 2836 or 2834, as well as the 2892 and the 7750, they all become of public domain. And given that Solita had all this expertise with movements, they decided to produce their own version of those ETA movements. They were basically copies, what we call as clones of the ETA movements. For example, the 2824 became the Solita SW200, the 2892 became the SW300, and the 7750 became the SW500. They actually have the SW1000, but it's not a clone of anything. It's their own design. And that became the biggest alternative for those smaller brands that couldn't afford to design and produce their own movements. Their escape was to purchase Solita movements. And one thing that I think it's important to mention, the brands that were capable of making their own movements, they tried to make the fact that they are manufacturers or that they have in-house movements, that this was a better thing than using outsourced movements. The problem is that some collectors and enthusiasts started to look at ETA movements like if they were a kind of a second-class movement. And I have to say that I don't agree with that. Of course that they don't have the exclusivity of an in-house movement, and of course that if you are talking about luxury goods, exclusivity is one of the key points. I completely understand this, but they don't. It's not fair to look at the ETA movements like if they were inferior. Much the opposite. They were by far one of the best mechanical movements ever made. It's difficult to think about something that is as reliable, as robust, and as accurate as an ETA movement. Maybe the only thing that I can think about is Rolex movements, honestly. And the reason is basically the same, is because they made the same kind of movements for so many years, actually decades, that this is a design that is completely proved, completely improved. So I really never saw the fact that a watch have an ETA movement inside to be a thing to be downgraded. Much the opposite. Really, it gives you a peace of mind to have such a reliable and robust mechanism inside your watch. But this is, of course, my opinion. So what started to happen is that the companies outside the Swatch group that use ETA movements, they started to swap them to Solita, and some of them don't even change the original name of the movement. For example, Tag Heuer, they call the old ETA 2824 was the Tag Heuer caliber 5, and they just replaced all the ETAs to Solitas SW200 and still call the caliber as caliber 5. The same happened with the caliber 16, that was the ETA 7750, and they swapped it to the SW500, and the name inside Tag Heuer stood the same. So this brings one of the questions that is very common, is how to know if your watch have an ETA or a Solita inside. Because what I noticed is that a lot of smaller brands, they didn't change their technical specs of their watches, so sometimes this is very misleading. You see a technical specs and it says that it's an ETA when it's really a Solita, because they couldn't get ETAs anymore. On the other hand, I really don't encourage you to get mad about this ETA and Solita thing, because in the end, they are basically the same movement. They have the same specs, the same dimensions, the same performance. Even though single components, they are not interchangeable, okay? Some components are interchangeable, but just by mere luck, okay? They are not meant to be interchangeable. If you have an ETA movement, you have to use ETA components, and if you have Solita, you have to use Solita components. But basically, the design is the same. There are some technical differences. For example, Solita used a different shape for the teeth of some gears. They think it's an improvement on their side. And also they used one more jewel, for example, for the SW200. The SW200 have 26 jewels instead of the 25 jewels from the ETA 2824. This jewel is for the barrel arbor. I don't think it's actually an improvement, because I have like 15 years of experience, almost everyday experience with those movements, and I never saw an ETA having a problem on that place using a bushing, a metal bushing instead of a jewel. But anyway, jewels are never too much, and even I will make a video about jewels, what they are and what is the importance of them. And jewels are never too much, so it's fine for me. And down to the biggest question is how to identify if your watch have a Sellita or a ETA movement, because at a certain distance, they look exactly the same. So the first thing that you have, of course, I am assuming that you can see the movement either by removing the case back or having a watch with a transparent case back. So the first thing that you can look for is if there is any mention to the number of jewels. If you can see that on the movement, you will see, if you see like 26 jewels, then it's a Sellita, and if you see 25 jewels, it's a ETA. Keep in mind that I am comparing exactly the ETA 2824 to the Solita SW200. But in case you can't see these inscriptions about the number of jewels, the second thing that you can see without any loop, you can see that by naked eye, is if the balance wheel bridge have two holes where you can see the feet of the bridge. Because on ETA, the feet of the bridge is on the bridge itself, and the holes where it fits in is on the main plate of the movement. So if you look to an ETA, you won't see anything on the base of the bridge. You won't see the feet of the bridge, while on the Solita you will see two holes where you can see the feet, because the feet stays on the main plate and the bridge have the holes to hold it. So on these images you can see the differences. So actually this difference happens in all of the bridges, not only the balance bridge, but the balance bridge is the easiest to see by naked eye. So if you see the holes, it's a Solita, and if you don't, it's an ETA. Now, another thing that you can look for is the stamp right below the balance wheel. It's not obligatory, but it's a kind of a standard of the Swiss industry to bring the stamp of the movement manufacturer and also the caliber right below the balance wheel. So in the ETA, you will see the ETA emblem, and then you see the number of caliber. In this case is 2836-2. The 2836 is just a 2824 with a double calendar, but it's basically the same movement. The -2 is actually because it's the third evolution of this caliber. The first one have nothing, is just the 2836. Then it evolved to the -1, and it was back on the 80s. And at the end of the 80s or the early 90s, it was already the -2. So this last generation of ETA movements already have almost 30 years of on the market. And on the Solita, you see the same. You have the Solita emblem, which is this stylized S, and then the name of the caliber, which is SW200-1. This means this is the second version of a SW200, because it already has some improvements since the first version. And basically that's it. I hope you like it. I hope you always learn something new from my videos. Don't forget to get me your thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe in case you didn't. Don't forget also to invite your friends that like watches and are watches aficionados, and keep following. Thank you very much, and until next time.